Welcome back to the show. I'm Paul Schmid, the host of The Pursuit Zone, a podcast that interviews explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 177 with Tristan Ridley. In this episode, I catch up with Tristan in the middle of his around-the-world cycling adventure. Tristan must have been in a coffee shop or a restaurant, or maybe a hostel when this was recorded, so you will hear a little bit of background noise. Let's start the show, and let me introduce my guest. After working and hitchhiking around Australia for 2 years, he bought a bike and spent 3 months cycling around New Zealand. He then cycled back to his home in England, starting in Papua New Guinea, where he came down with dengue fever and was chased by men wielding machetes. After working 16 months in England, the cycling adventure continued through Northern Europe before riding south into the Balkans. In December 2018, he rode into the Middle East and onward into North Africa. Currently in Tanzania, he is just over halfway to his goal of cycling 100,000 kilometers through 100 countries on 6 continents. Part of his adventure is to raise funds for Build Africa, a UK charity working to fight poverty in Kenya and Uganda by using education to combat inequality. You can learn more about his adventures at his website, tristanridley.com. Tristan Ridley, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much for having me.
Tristan, where is your hometown?
I'm from a very small village in Sussex in the southeast of England, kind of place where nothing really happens and lots of people go to retire. So it's very pretty there, but it's the kind of place I was very keen to escape from. As a child, it's the kind of place where there's nothing actually happening. So I guess in a way it was an excellent introduction to a life of constantly moving, because it definitely didn't make me want to stay there for very long. But at the same time, it was, a nice enough place to grow up. Not anything nasty to be said about it, really. Just a very quiet little place.
Tristan, what did you end up studying in university?
Well, I did a fairly useless degree in philosophy and politics, which, of course, is not much use if you're planning on going into anything specific. So I just kind of mainly went to university for the experience and not quite sure what I wanted to do with myself at that point. From there, I finished university, and within about 2 days of my last exam, I had already set off traveling, starting out with a backpacking trip around Europe. And then I worked for just long enough to fund a one-way flight out to Australia, and pretty much went out there on a credit card with no particular plan other than just try and get a job fairly quickly and just kind of be free. Because after being stuck at university for 3 years, although I loved it, I was very fed up by the end with just being in one place, and itchy feet had very much kicked in. So I was very pleased to be able to escape to the other side of the world.
Now, you were in Australia, I think, for 2 years working and hitchhiking around. What kind of jobs were you doing when you were there?
I did all sorts of jobs over there. I mean, it was just sort of whatever I could get at the time. So I worked bars, waiting tables. I worked for 3 months driving tractors on a banana farm. I worked a lot of different sales jobs for travel companies and party companies, all sorts of different things, really, just as I say, whatever could kind of pay the bills. Because I wasn't really looking to stop anywhere for very long. So it was just always somewhere to get some quick cash together so I could then keep going. But nothing too specific, just bits and pieces, really.
And during this time, you started somehow looking into cycle touring or the idea of cycling. How did that all happen? How did you get into that?
Well, I was never a cyclist at all, and I still claim that I'm not a cyclist, really, although it's getting harder to do that. I hadn't really cycled since I was about 10 when I started. So I've been doing a lot of hitchhiking just because I found it a nice way to get around, and it was cheap, and I was always on a budget with not much money to work with. And I became increasingly sort of weary of hitchhiking just because I found myself very limited, because I was always reliant on other people, of course, to get a lift, and I'd end up missing places. I'd have a lift, I'd be driving along, it would all be great, and I'd see, maybe a waterfall or something of interest off to the side of the road, and I'd always have this dilemma of, I'd like to go and see it, but I've then got to get out of the car, I've got to walk, it might take me a few hours to get there might be nothing, then got to walk back and then get another lift, which could take another few hours. So it might be a whole day just to see this thing that might be nothing. So more often than not, I'd end up just staying in the car. And that just kind of didn't really strike me as the kind of freedom that I really wanted. I wanted to be able to just explore whenever and wherever I wanted. So I was looking at other options, and I was just kind of reading books, and one of the books I read was a book by Al Humphreys, who cycled around the world about 20 years ago. That kind of opened my eyes to the whole concept of actually traveling long distances by bicycle. I gave it a test run when I was working in Cairns in northern Australia, and it was an absolute miserable failure. I bought this appallingly bad second-hand mountain bike, and knowing nothing about bicycles at the time, I had no idea just how absolutely crap this bike was. And I just had this idea for a day trip that I was going to cycle about 25 kilometers south, climb a mountain, climb back down, and then cycle back to my flat. I did get back, but I was limping for a good week afterwards. I was absolutely shattered. My legs were obviously not used to cycling, and bearing in mind how bad this bike was, it was just an absolute pain trip. And I immediately abandoned the idea of traveling by bicycle as just an indulgence in masochism, really. A few months later, I sort of forgot about that and tried again with a better bike, and it was a lot more fun, and I really enjoyed it. So I quite quickly and slightly foolhardily bought the touring bike with this idea to go to New Zealand and this experience. I would then try and cycle back from there to England. So that's how I sort of started. It was all just kind of an accident. I sort of fell into it, got carried away, and here I am.
That second bike, I'm trying to determine, like, when did you... Or was it in Australia that you purchased that long-haul trucker, your first kind of good bike, I guess?
Yeah, my first proper tour. Yeah, it was. It was right towards the end in Australia. I'd saved up some money, and I decided I thought it would be worth getting a good bike, especially though I had no idea about bikes other than just reading as many forums and as much information as I could on the internet, because none of my friends were really into bikes, so I didn't have anyone I could really ask for advice on that. So I thought I would just buy a fairly conventional touring bike, which the long-haul trucker is. I mean, it's a great bike, very comfortable, and I had no bad things to say about it, really. It got me from Australia to England very comfortably with no problems at all. So, yeah, that was right before I left Australia. I'd only actually ridden a very short distance on it in Australia before I flew to New Zealand. Virtually, I cycled from Brisbane, where I bought the thing, down to the Gold Coast airport, where I flew to Christchurch. So I'd only actually done a couple of 100 kilometres on this thing before I started out with this big ride through New Zealand. So I definitely hadn't done any training or much in the way of practice for this big ride. It was pretty much in at the deep end from the start.
Did you start out, because your setup is like the bike packing setup, like the frame bag in the middle, the bag hanging off the back of the saddle. Did you start in the beginning like that, or did you like evolve into that?
No, it was very much an evolution. I actually started with a full kind of fairly heavy duty touring setup, which is much more common for long distance cyclists, which is the kind of 4 panniers, handlebar bag, and a sicked bag on the back rack as well. So it wasn't insanely heavy, but it was fairly standard, to be honest, for most tourers. And I came into that having been traveling mainly by hitchhiking for the last few years with a tiny backpack. And so I think I went a little bit overboard initially. It was just a delight to have all this space to work with instead of being limited to a small backpack. So I started out with quite a lot, but then very quickly I realized that actually I didn't need all the space. I'm quite minimalistic. I like having as little as I can, really. So but within the 3 months that I was in New Zealand, I was already starting to think, well, this is really unnecessary. So after another few months, once I'd made it through to Malaysia, I sent my front 2 panniers home just because I found I didn't need them. So then I was down to just the rear ones, and that got me all the way through back to England. And then after that, I decided to switch to a kind of, as I say, a bike packing style setup, and eventually changed bikes as well. Sold my long haul trucker and picked up an ECR, so the ECR, which is a sort of mid-fat bike with big 3-inch, massive 29-inch, 3-inch tires. And the whole motivation for that, both switching the bikes and switching the luggage system, was, especially after a year of touring, I found I was gravitating more and more to the kind of off-road stuff, and that the kind of riding that I was enjoying the most and found most interesting was really getting as far off the beaten track as I could, finding those single track sections, the beautiful remote dirt roads. And I just didn't really want to be riding on those kind of major paved roads anymore, because I'd done quite a lot of it. And I've nothing against riding on paved roads, but They tend to be busier, they tend to be less interesting. So I wanted a bike and a luggage system that could better handle those kinds of surfaces. And the 4 panniers or even 2 panniers, they rattle around a lot. They don't handle very well in terms of the weight distribution, and they're a bit bulky. So I decided to switch to the much more streamlined and much lighter bikepacking setup, which I'm using now.
Well, let's talk about the beginning of that, what I'm calling part one, when you left New Zealand and you started in Papua New Guinea, because that sounds, from your write-up, pretty crazy time. Dengue fever, getting chased by guys with machetes. What was that like riding through Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, I mean, Papua New Guinea, it all kind of, I sort of fell into it, to be honest, because I mean, I flew into New Zealand and I had this rough notion even then that I'd like to try and make it back to England without flying if possible. But I thought I'd probably have to fly back out of New Zealand just because it's, a very isolated island and I was there at the wrong time of year for boats. So I thought, I sort of looked at the map and looked at the nearest big bit of land that wasn't Australia and thought, well, if I'm going to cheat, I'm going to try and do it as little as possible and fly to the nearest place at which I can get out. And I mean, the easiest thing would have been just to fly to Singapore and Bali maybe, but both seemed a little bit too easy. So I actually arrived at the airport in Australia with this intent to fly into New Zealand. And they told me at the airport that I wouldn't be allowed into New Zealand without an exit flight, which I didn't have at that stage. And I was running a little bit late, so I only had about 10 minutes to decide on a destination and book a flight. So with very little planning, I just kind of settled on Papua New Guinea. I looked at it on the map and thought, oh, well, it should be possible to cross over to West Papua, the west half of the island, which is part of Indonesia. And I was sure that there'd be boats leading from there to kind of the main parts of Indonesia, Java, or even up to Singapore. Just eyeballing the map, I thought it should be fine. So I booked the flight. And then once I started actually researching the country, Papua New Guinea, and how to travel through it, I realized I'd really got myself in deep water because there's not a whole lot of infrastructure in the country. The capital is in the south, Port Moresby, and the only major roads really are in the north of the island, running fairly close to the coast, which run west towards the only crossable border, which is in the sort of northwest of Papua New Guinea. But there's no actual way to connect by land really between Port Moresby in the south and the north, because there's a big mountain range running right across the middle of the country, which is impassable. There are no roads running through. There's only one hiking trail called the Kokoda Trail, which goes through the middle. But that one is extremely expensive to walk these days because you need permits, guides, and it's all very expensive. I didn't have the money to do that, and it wouldn't have been much fun with the bike anyway. I basically flew into the country with no plan other than just have to kind of try and figure it out when I got there. And the feedback I'd got from the various people that I'd contacted or emailed in the country was extremely disheartening. I got lots of replies telling me that I must be mad and that I was going to get myself killed from expats and locals alike, really, because Papua New Guinea is quite dangerous. There's quite a lot of banditry issues and various other problems that they have there. But in fact, it just about worked out. I was able to eventually make it round by taking several small boats around the Eastern Cape and up to the north, and then eventually I was able to get onto the limited road network and make it across. But yeah, I certainly had my fair share of challenges on that section, and I wouldn't really recommend Papua New Guinea as a cycling destination. I did have an amazing experience there, and I'd say it's probably the country I'm certainly most proud of crossing, considering the experiences I had there. But certainly I don't think it's a good place to have a bike. I mean, I was going through by bike, but it would have been vastly easier just to have done it with a backpack, I think.
What happens when you get dengue fever? I mean, does that knock you out and take you out of action for a certain amount of time?
Yeah, it's pretty unpleasant. I mean, I haven't had malaria, thankfully, yet, but it's, I think, similar sort of experience. I mean, my experience, ironically, I'd been in touch with a charity group called Rotary Against Malaria who'd asked me to give a couple of talks going around about the epidemic of dengue that was going on in Papua New Guinea, and they thought it was very funny when I got in touch with them and told them that I had dengue. Now, I initially thought I had sunstroke because I was riding in sort of 40-degree heat and the humidity was pretty much maxed out, and I was extremely nervous about the risk of banditry anyway, so I was in a bit of a state, and I I thought I had sunstroke come on, and it was only sort of a day or two later that I sort of put the dots together and realized it was dengue. And yeah, I was laid out for about a week. I was very fortunate in that I was taken in by a Papua New Guinean family in a tiny village in the middle of nowhere, who were unbelievably generous and welcoming and kind to me, and gave me a room to put my tent up in, just a mosquito net. And I pretty much just lay there on the wooden floor, dead to the world, for about a week. I couldn't eat. I couldn't really drink much. I must have lost sort of 5 or 10 kilograms in that week. I was just completely wrecked. I wouldn't recommend it, between us, but it's not the end of the world. So lots of people get dengue and carry on. Obviously, in the middle of nowhere in Papua New Guinea is not an ideal place to have to deal with it, but I got through, so I'm not trying to complain too much.
You carried on your adventure. There's a lot of countries here to talk about, so I'll just let you decide if we should skip over them or if there's any highlights you want to hit. But your next section was you're getting into Indonesia now and into Southeast Asia. Any interesting things happened during that time?
Compared to Papua New Guinea, it was all rather mellow, to be honest. I mean, I do remember thinking, at first it was great, just how simple and safe and easy it all was riding through. But certainly it was a lot less exciting than Papua New Guinea was. Java was not a very fun place to cycle because the pollution is so bad. Malaysia was pretty easy, and Thailand it's all generally quite nice and easy. Southeast Asia is so westernized now anyway. Thailand is one entire country of 7-Elevens. So it's not my favorite country to cycle, just because for me, I like slightly more out there, sort of interesting, slightly wilder places. And these days, Southeast Asia is just so tamed by tourism and by the sheer number of backpackers that go there that I didn't find it particularly remarkable. It's very pretty and very nice, but it wasn't quite what I was really looking for. So I just kind of was on autopilot for that stretch, just kind of going through and having fun, but not having any particularly remarkable experiences, I wouldn't say. It wasn't until I got through, Laos is very nice, to be fair, that's a little bit more interesting. But it wasn't until I got through into China that things started getting a little bit, I'd say, a little bit more exciting for me.
Yeah, and at this point, you're going very fast because you've set a goal for yourself to make it home to England by Christmas. And I have it here that over the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau and then through the Taklamakan Desert, you did 4,300 kilometers in 27 days. That is really, really moving. So tell me about some of your experiences through China.
I hadn't actually planned at that stage to get back for Christmas. I'd just been kind of moving at a sort of standard pace through much of Southeast Asia and then up into China. And in China, it wasn't trying to get back for Christmas that was motivating me. It was simply visa restrictions, because China, I'd had quite a tough time getting a visa for that country anyway, and particularly considering I was going around through Tibet and not quite through the autonomous region of Tibet, but skirting around it. And the Chinese are very sensitive about that, particularly for people on bicycles, because obviously we have a lot more freedom than the average traveller if you have your own form of transport. So I'd eventually managed to, through fibbing with various fake itineraries and fake hotel bookings, I managed to get 30 days Chinese visa with the ability to extend it by a further 30 days. It's not quite as easy as all that, because only certain towns or cities will allow you to extend it, and they're quite spread out. So I managed to get my visa extended, but by the time they actually granted it, because it took a few days for them to process it. It took 3 days, and they took those 3 days out of the 30 days, so I ended up with only 27 days to leave the country from where I was, and I'd been told that I wouldn't be able to extend a second time. So I pretty much had to get out of the country within those 27 days, but I had to cross the entire Tibetan Plateau, cross right through the middle of the Taklamakan Desert and out and through into Kazakhstan in that time frame. I'd worked out that I thought my distance was going to have to be about 3,700 kilometers to cover in the 27 days. So I'd sort of worked out that I needed to do about 140 kilometers per day for 27 days without any days off in order to make it through, which I thought would be tough, but just about doable. I wasn't helped by the wind right across the whole of China, with the exception of, I think, 2 days. I had a strong headwind every single day, so that wasn't very fun. But I ended up running into problems. In the last week, I had a bit of a nightmare. I was actually ahead of schedule, and I was very much on track to comfortably make it out. And then I ran into a bit of an issue with a road was restricted by the Chinese military. they had closed the road. There'd been some unrest. That region of China, the northwest Xinjiang, is quite tense due to issues between the native Uyghur people there and the central Chinese government in Beijing. And something must have happened because they closed this road completely. And I wasn't able to get through. I tried sneaking through. I was nearly arrested. And I suddenly found myself having to do this enormous detour. And instead of, at that stage, I think I had 5 days left on the visa. And instead of sort of 400 or 500 kilometers in those 5 days, which would have been quite cruisy, I suddenly had to do 1,000 kilometers in 5 days, having not had a day off for more than 3 weeks. And I was just already knackered and ragged. I hadn't had a shower in that period either. I was just a mess. And I just had to kind of go for it. So I did just about end up making it out with literally about 5 minutes to spare, having just about crossed the border. And certainly that was the toughest physical challenge I've had, I would say, so far in more than 2 years of cycling, was that month, that 27-day period, having to cycle right across the Himalayas into the wind every day, covering that kind of mileage. I wouldn't do it again. I'll put it like that.
Oh, man. Well, now you're out of China. You're getting into Central Asia on the Silk Road. Does it get any easier at that point?
Yeah, well, it settled right down immediately, actually. I mean, I got through. I decided to just push on the last few days to get into Kyrgyzstan. Unbelievable country, certainly one of my favorites that I've been through. And I had my first shower in 31 days, which was probably good for the world and very fun for me. And I actually took it easy. I sort of carried on eventually at a fairly mellow pace, just riding on the Silk Road, incredible part of the world. Really, really love Central Asia. Yeah, I went through Bishkek and eventually managed to get a visa for Uzbekistan. So I went back through Kazakhstan again. Amazing highlights of the Silk Road there. Samarkand, the Registan, and Bukhara. Really just an amazing part of the world. It was getting a bit cold. Winter had started by then. I was there a little bit late in the season. So I was dealing with kind of snow and cold temperatures, which I wasn't really kitted out for. And I made it to Bukhara. I was in Bukhara on the 25th of October, which is my birthday, 2 months before Christmas. And it was then that I made this decision to try and actually cycle back to surprise my family, who I hadn't seen at this point for about 3 years, for Christmas. Because, I don't know, it seemed like a good idea at the time, I suppose. I figured it's winter, so I want to be moving quite fast anyway. I was running out of money, so I couldn't afford to muck around too much longer anyway, and I really didn't have the equipment, I say, for properly cold Central Asian temperatures. So I decided just to bomb it and try and get through in time. And ultimately, I did just about make it. I very narrowly caught the ferry on Christmas Eve from Dunkirk over to Dover. I very nearly missed that one, which would have been a bit of a catastrophe. But I did just about make it, and ultimately managed to make it back in time to surprise the family, which was certainly made the whole thing worthwhile.
Yeah, that's after riding from Baku, I think, back to England, averaging almost 100 miles a day for 2 months straight. Man, that is a lot of riding.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of riding. The thing, I mean, winter was the main challenging factor, I would say, for that section, because it was dark so early. I mean, by the time I got to England, it was sort of 3:30 in the afternoon, and it was dark. So I was having to do so much night riding, and I mean, through a lot of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey. Eastern Europe as well. I mean, it was really, my kit was useless because I didn't have the money to buy anything better. So, I mean, I was having to camp out at sort of minus 10, minus 12 Celsius, I should say. I mean, I was just shivering my way through the night, wearing everything I had. Just couldn't wait for the sun to come up every morning. But, I mean, it's one of them. I mean, it doesn't always have to be fun to be fun. That's another thing. I'd never do that again, but I'm very glad I did. And sometimes those kind of experiences where you are kind of miserable at the time and really pushing yourself as far and as hard as you can, once you do actually achieve whatever goal it is you're after, that feeling of satisfaction is really incomparable to anything else. If you haven't had to do that and haven't really pushed your boundaries like that, then you can't really understand how that feels. But anyone that has done that will know exactly what I'm talking about.
What was your family's reaction when you showed up?
Oh, it was hilarious. My mother was actually physically shaking. My father looked like he'd seen a ghost. My sister claims she knew all along that it was me, but anyway, she was just a bit puzzled. But no, it was really special. I mean, especially having not seen them for so long, it was very cool just to be able to rock up and spring that kind of surprise. Because I'd been setting it up for months. I mean, I'd been lying to the world at large about my whereabouts. Only a few trusted friends had been let in on the secret. I'd been leaving a trail of false information on social media about where I was. So I mean, I was in France, telling my parents that I just made it to Istanbul, and that I was planning on spending Christmas in Turkey and making jokes about that, while all the time trying to make sure that nothing slipped out. Because it would have been absolutely horrendous if something had somehow slipped up and they discovered me only a few weeks away from being home. But yeah, it was definitely a very cool experience. Although it definitely set the bar pretty high as far as Christmas goes. So I mean, I don't know how I can really top that.
So you take some time off, 16 months, I think, to work and save up some money. What were you doing during that time for work?
I was working for a local call centre that was a company that organises caravan and motorhome kind of holidays, membership package, insurance, all sorts of bits and pieces. I mean, it's certainly not something I planned on. I mean, I've never really been interested or looking at career at this stage for myself. For me, it was just a convenient job that paid reasonably well and was sort of close to home. So I was able to just save as much of my income as I could and try not to spend much, because pretty much from the start, I knew that I was going to go out again. I mean, the last couple of months, I had completely promised myself that I was done, because, riding 100 miles a day through winter, I was tired, I was fed up, I didn't want to be cycling. I thought, right, once I'm back, I'm done with it, or I'll settle down. Selective amnesia is a very unfortunate trait, which is pretty much I blame for most of what I've done. And that, once you've settled back, you quite quickly forget all the pain and you just remember the good times. So it wasn't long before I'd more or less decided, right, well, this is very boring being back, and normal life seems very dull. So I started thinking and started planning, and so quite early on I thought, well, I'm going to need to work again, because I was completely flat broke by the time I did make it back to England. And I thought, well, if I'm going to go out again, I've got to go bigger, because now I knew that I was capable of riding around the world, riding for a year. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I've got to go big. So I don't know, it sort of escalated quite quickly over too many beers, and I ended up coming up with this idea of 100,000 kilometers through 100 countries around the world, including the 25,000 kilometers in 25 countries that I'd already cycled. So I pretty much set myself a deadline. How long can I survive working in a normal job before I'm going to go mad? And I pretty much just stuck it out as long as I thought I could stay sane. And then once I had enough money, and once I thought I couldn't endure anymore, spring last year I hit the road again. And I've been just riding ever since.
Are you still sticking to that giant goal that you set for yourself, the 100,000 kilometers, 100 countries? Or are you thinking of maybe adjusting that?
No, I'm still on track. I mean, there's definitely been times when I've cursed myself bitterly for such a ridiculous goal, but I think that was sort of part of the reason I set it for myself, because I thought if I set myself something quite silly, something far out of reach, then I'll sort of be forced to keep going. Because, I mean, telling people you're going to do something is a good way to keep doing it. If you're too stubborn to admit that it was too much, then you'll just keep going out of pig-headedness, which isn't a great reason to do something. But I knew that it was going to be worth doing it. And there's definitely been times, I mean, it's not all roses. There's definitely days when everything's miserable, you hurt, the wind's up, the weather, it's just, some days you think, what on earth am I doing here? And you just think, oh, why did I tell people I would do this distance? If I hadn't told people, I could just give up and quietly go home. But then, you get through that, and then you think, actually, no, I am glad I've got this big goal, because I'm glad I'm still doing it. I'm glad I haven't quit. I know I'm going to hit that, 100,000. I mean, it's fairly nominal for me. I'm not really doing it for that. It's nice to have a rough goal in mind, and I quite like the sort of roundness of 100,000 kilometers in 100 countries. But it's never really been about that target for me. It's been more about the experience along the way, about seeing as much of the world, and ultimately just having a good old-fashioned adventure. And having some big target is just a useful way to achieve that, I find.
Well, how do you keep yourself motivated out there, Tristan? Do you have any mental games that you play with yourself?
Well, I suppose it's just a case of ploughing on. I mean, there's always going to be boring stretches. Right now I'm feeling very, very good and very sort of motivated. But I mean, the last time I had a sort of a mental waver, I suppose, would be towards the end of last year, I think. I was go down through the Balkans, down through also some of the Middle East and North Africa into Egypt. I was just kind of getting a little bit road fatigued. Like I'd been riding pretty hard because I wanted to beat the seasons, and I was just kind of feeling quite tired and like I needed a proper break, but I hadn't really allowed myself to have that because I was sort of up against the seasons a little bit. So I was just kind of feeling weary and going on just for the sake of going on. I think ultimately for me, it's been a lesson, a learning experience just to force myself to take those breaks that I need, because once you've been traveling for a while, and this is true, I think, whether you're cycling or just backpacking or driving, whatever you're doing, it starts to become routine and you're no longer really excited for it. It just becomes more of the same, oh, look, another waterfall, and you just don't get any kind of magic from it. So I think it's really important to take those longer breaks now and then when you start feeling that sense of mundanity to the whole thing and your wanderlust has sort of gone, to actually take that break and stop for a month or 2 months, however long it takes for you to kind of recharge. And that's hard for me because my instinct has always been to kind of push on. And I've always had this thought of, if I'm suffering, if I'm, not enjoying it, it's, oh, come on, don't be a wimp, get on with it and just keep going. But actually, it's, I think, not the way to go. I think, especially on such a long trip, it is important to take those longer breaks. So that's certainly something that I have to kind of stop and kick myself to do.
At this point, you're on your new bike, the ECR, with your bikepacking setup, and you're heading out towards, I think it's Sweden first, and then into Norway. I watched one of your videos where you started on some sort of Swedish cycling trail I'd never heard of before. Can you kind of tell us about what was it like cycling up there in Scandinavia?
Yeah, I think the route you're thinking of is the Kattegatleden, which is a cycling route that runs up the west coast of southern Sweden, up as far as Gothenburg. And yeah, it's a wonderful part of the world. That Scandinavia is so incredibly modern in so many ways. I can't say I've been to the States yet, but certainly compared to England and most of Europe that I've ever been to, Scandinavia is certainly a couple of steps ahead. So it's also ordered and it's very pretty, very expensive as well. It's such a nice, easy and safe place to be cycling. And yeah, I started out obviously going the wrong direction to Africa, which is where I was sort of headed. But I wasn't in any particular rush. 100,000 kilometers is far enough that there's no point hastening anything because it's a long way away. So I thought I might as well explore. I'd always wanted to go up to Norway, and I had quite a lot of friends in Sweden that I wanted to see. So I thought, yeah, let's do it. And yeah, Sweden was beautiful. The further north I got, the nicer it got. Norway was utterly spectacular. I was incredibly fortunate in that I was there around about May last year, 2018, and it just coincided with the best summer they've had in generations. I think they had the hottest month of May in 70 odd years. When I was there, I had a month in Norway, which is famously one of the wettest countries in the world, or at least it seems to be, and I didn't have a drop of rain for nearly a month. It wasn't until right at the end that it rained. I had 30 degrees in Norway in May, which is almost unheard of. So it was just incredibly lucky and definitely made up for some of the headwind that I had to suffer through for those many months through China. The kind of karmic scales balanced out a little bit there. But yeah, I rode through and then crossed back over into Sweden, crossed into the Baltics, and that was actually where I switched bikes when I got to Latvia, to Riga. I swapped bikes there. I'd been using the old touring bike, the long haul trucker through Scandinavia up to that point, and that was partly the reason why I swapped, was because it was then that I'd been trying to push the boundaries with this older bike. It was still running beautifully, but it was just wasn't really what it was made for. So I was riding all these quite challenging trails and just getting beaten up pretty bad and not having a great time on that bike. So that was what sort of pushed me to switch, because I felt like I wanted to be able to ride those trails and enjoy them, not be kind of gritting my teeth through subjecting this bike to something it wasn't really made for. I don't know, I think a lot of the motivation behind switching was to do with mentality, because if you're riding a bike that's kind of designed and centered around roads, paved roads, you can ride them off-road, but it's not going to be much fun because you're getting beaten up doing it. So when you get to a choice where you can think, okay, I can take the dirt road option or I can take the nice paved road option, you're more often than not just going to think, oh, let's take the paved option because it's just so much less uncomfortable. Whereas if you've got a bike that's kitted out and designed for those off-road sections, you got the opposite mentality. You're thinking, oh, come on, I'm riding this bike, let's use it. So you, more often than not, you will take those interesting remote dirt road sections. That was a big part of why I swapped, and it's definitely happened the way I sort of hoped. Like, I've been able to ride so many sections which would have been an absolute nightmare on the old bike.
So did you have opportunity to research the bike you wanted and like have it delivered to you in I think you said Riga, or did you walk into a bike shop and just find it and say, oh, this looks great, I'll take it?
No, there was a lot of research that went into it. By that I mean, so when I bought the first bike, I didn't really know what I wanted. I knew nothing about bikes at that stage. So I just kind of went with a common consensus bike touring option, which was a good choice. I mean, it was a safe bet and it got me back. By the time I bought the second one, I knew much more specifically what I wanted, what I was going to be using it for. So yeah, I mean, hours and hours of researching, mulling over options. The reason I switched in Riga was because just by coincidence, I happened to be, I had to fly back to the UK for a wedding. So I flew back just for a bit over a week. So I just arranged it that I could basically pick up the new bike in England. I sort of ordered it with a bike shop in London, and then I just went down, collected it, and then flew back with it to Riga, and then I set off again on the new steed from there.
Next, you are heading into the Middle East. You spent some time on the Jordan Trail. Tell me about that.
Yeah, Jordan, again, amazing country. The Jordan bike trails are a long-distance cycling route that runs through Jordan from the north to the south. And I've been incredibly excited about going to see Jordan for years. As a big fan of Indiana Jones, I'd always wanted to see Petra. So I was very stoked to be able to actually go there. And the Jordan bike trail does go through Petra as well as Wadi Rum, which is this incredible desert in the south, which was made famous by the film Lawrence of Arabia. And it's also been used for various other movies that on a kind of Mars-like landscape. So yeah, I followed the trail down through Jordan. Absolutely incredible, beautiful place. I mean, hard work. It's very, very steep, so it's tough on the legs. But just an incredible place. Jordan was definitely a highlight. That was an amazing place. Not easy, but if you like a challenge, I can certainly recommend the Jordan Bike Trail.
When you're in Petra, those facades of those buildings like carved into the rock look amazing. Are you allowed to go inside there, or only can see from the outside?
I mean, you can sort of go in and around. I mean, some of the most famous ones. I mean, the most famous sort of temple in Petra is the monastery. Or sorry, no, I should say the treasury is the main one. That's the sort of Indiana Jones one. That's the kind of highlight. And I mean, actually, the inside of that is just a small room. And you're not allowed to go into those. They are fenced off. But even if you could, you wouldn't really see anything. It's just a small square cutout sort of wall with nothing. It's just a sort of small square room. There's nothing really in there. The really remarkable thing is what you can see from the outside. But there are loads of places you can go in. I mean, there's hundreds of buildings around there. I mean, houses, settlements, other temples that you can actually go right into. I mean, the whole complex of Petra, I mean, it's not really it's a city. I mean, that's what it ultimately, that's what it was. So it's an enormous area. And, you could spend days and days happily exploring, crawling around, climbing. So yeah, it's an enormous place. And I think quite justifiably, it's one of the modern wonders of the world.
Well, let's get into Egypt for a bit, because I know that's an area where you had some challenges, and I wanted to talk about those. Let me start, because I pulled a couple of quotes off your blog, and I'll just start with this first one here. Seeing the pyramids was amazing, but I felt none of the spark that I feel from standing on top of a mountain or watching the sun rise over the ocean. That, I think, is why I appreciate traveling by bicycle. Destinations become secondary to the spaces in between, those unnamed places bursting with natural beauty, which you cannot get to except by finding yourself there. I love that quote. So you find yourself, where do you start in Egypt?
I started in Sinai. So I took a ferry across the sea there to Nuweiba, which is right on the far east side of Sinai. And then I eventually made it through across Sinai to Cairo and then south. But yeah, certainly, I mean, the pyramids, again, it was another, similarly to Petra, it was a place I'd wanted to see, since a child. I mean, I learned about the ancient Egyptians, and I was sort of captivated by this idea of the pyramids even as a boy. But I was interested going to actually visit them. I mean, as I say, they're spectacular to see. I mean, the architecture is incredible. The scale of them, that people built that thousands of years ago. Certainly, it's an amazing place to see, and I'm very grateful to have been able to see it. But yeah, as I say, I mean, certainly, I mean, the feeling I felt there was not anywhere near as special as how I tend to feel if I've just summited a mountain, or I've found myself in the middle of nowhere. I mean, or not long afterwards, camping in the middle of the Sahara, going through into Sudan. I think part of it is just, I mean, for me personally, I'm more interested in nature than I am in architecture and man-made structures. I mean, that's just a personal thing. But also, I think I'm very particular with my sort of beauty. I like to have it to myself. I'm very spoiled in that way. I like to have it to myself without too many people around to bother me. And of course, the pyramids being what they are incredibly popular and one of the most well-known tourist destinations in the world. It's full of tourists, and it's full of people trying to sell you things, and it's in Cairo, which is a brilliant but mad city. So it's certainly not a kind of relaxed, kind of contenting sort of place to sort of visit. And that's sort of what I meant by that quote, I suppose, from having this idea that destinations become secondary. And I think that is quite unique to cycling, or just, I suppose, if you were walking or running long distance as well. But because you spend so much more time in between places, if you're traveling by bus or you're driving, then, I mean, you can quite quickly hop from destination to destination. I mean, if you talk to most people that are backpacking, traveling around that way, they'll say, I went to this place and then I went to that place. And because you can get from A to B so quickly, it just kind of, you hop on the bus and that takes you to the destination, and then you do something there, and you hop on the bus and you're at the next place. Whereas it doesn't work that way if you're cycling or if you're hiking somewhere, because you spend, it might take you several days to get from one place to the next place. So it becomes all about the journey rather than about those destinations, which I think is what makes it so interesting to me, because you get to all these places that you wouldn't go there to go there. I mean, you wouldn't these kind of beautiful mountain roads and trails through the hills. They're not on any tourist map. You've got no one saying, you should really go and be on this road or go to that place, because they're not big enough or famous enough, and there's no money to be had. So people aren't telling people to go there. But if you find yourself there because you're going through, you suddenly realize that, wow, this is amazing. And you've usually got those places all to yourself as well. So that, I think, is a big part of why I love cycling as a means of travel.
Can you tell the story about how you got held by gunpoint by these bandits, I guess we'll call them?
Yeah, God. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a long story. I mean,
it starts right with the police, because when you're in Egypt, the police are trying to protect you as a tourist. So, and as a cyclist, I imagine that's a real pain in the butt to have to deal with these guys, because they're kind of slowing you down, and they're funneling you into only trying to go in certain places. And so, as I understand it, you're trying to kind of ditch these guys and make your own way, and that's when you eventually end up in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, in Egypt, the government is exceptionally paranoid about its tourist industry, justifiably, I suppose, because their tourist industry is a big part of their economy, and it completely tanked following the Arab Springs, the revolution, and so they're very careful now. They're slowly building it back up. And as a cyclist, they've sort of labelled you as a cyclist as a particular danger or a particularly vulnerable person, which is fair, I suppose, because you are uniquely vulnerable on a bike. So ultimately, for most of the way through Egypt, once they know that you're there, you're subjected to these compulsory police escorts. So they'll force you to ride on the highway with a police escort following impatiently behind you. And I mean, for the second half of the time that I was in Egypt, I had to deal with this. And I mean, the officers themselves, it's not their fault. I mean, they're just doing their job. Most of them are nice enough, but it's just very frustrating for everyone involved. I mean, they don't really want you to be, they want you just to take a lift, and you don't want them there at all. So it's just kind of not a very pleasant way to travel through a country. But for the first half or so of the country, I knew all about this, so I thought, right, I'm going to try and avoid them, basically avoid any major roads, stick to these kind of very remote single track and dirt roads, which I prefer anyway, and just try and get as far as I can before the police discover me. And I mean, for sort of 3 days or so, it all went very well. I was able to avoid detection. It was all quite thrilling, the sort of cops and robbers game that I was playing through the country. And I got to see some incredible parts of Egypt too, places where, again, you would never go as a tourist because there's nothing specific there. But by passing through, you get to see how just normal people live, which is I think what's interesting to me about traveling is just how ordinary people live, not going to big tourist destinations. I was having a great time, and then I found myself on this very remote road. The whole robbery was a bit of a drawn-out affair. It wasn't a quick snatch and grab. It all started fairly harmless and then escalated. It's kind of bad luck that it happened when it did. I just finished cooking, so all my stuff was kind of strewn everywhere, and then a couple of young men turned up, started getting aggressive and demanding passports and money, claiming to be the police, which I was fairly sure they weren't. And then very quickly more turned up, and then I had 11 of them around me. And I mean, I say it's a bit of a long story. I've recently finished an article which is on my website if anyone is interested in reading more about it. But ultimately, I was very lucky to get away with losing only my sunglasses. One guy had a gun in my face. Most of the others had small knives surrounded. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I got away with it. I think I just tried to stay as polite and respectful and calm as I could. Luckily, it didn't get worse than it did. But certainly, it was a bit of an eye-opener. It's quite remarkable how when something like that happens, it changes your whole perspective on a place. Because prior to that, I mean, I'd been having a great time. I'd been pretty confident that I was safe. I had this sort of view that, oh, the police are a real bother. It's not really dangerous. They're overreacting. It's all kind of hype. And then this happened, and suddenly I was like, oh, God, wow, okay. That whole time when I thought I was safe, this could have happened any time. It could happen again. And so, I mean, there's a real temptation when that happens to really go to pieces, to become incredibly paranoid and start, just cycling very closed off, not talking to anyone because you suspect everyone of being a potential murderer. I mean, I've been through that kind of situation before. I'm not going to say luckily, but I mean, luckily nothing bad happened. And I did go through this whole sort of mental battle before and came out on the other side concluding that ultimately, the risks are relatively low, that something really bad is going to happen. So I think the best bet is just to hope for the best, because, on a bike going around the world, ultimately, I'm not a religious man, but you're in God's hands, as it were, because, anyone that wants to do you harm can, basically. You can't really hide, you can't really run. So you just have to trust that the world isn't for the people that want to get you, and just hope for the best. And luckily, that is the case, generally speaking. Most people are just nice people that want to help or want to talk to you and don't mean you any harm. So ultimately, that's going to work out.
What country comes after Egypt?
After Egypt, it was down into Sudan, which is unfortunately going through a really tough time at the moment. Sudan is really actually a special country to me, I suppose. And virtually anyone that's ever been to the Sudan has exactly the same experience there. I know that Sudan has a bad reputation, and certainly in the States. I mean, it's been for years on the terror watch list. And most of the reason for that is their president, al-Bashir, who's now gone. But, he's an awful human being who facilitated a genocide in Darfur in the West, and obviously the South. They had civil war. South Sudan has now broken away. So a lot of people perceive Sudan to be very dangerous. But in fact, with the exception of those conflict areas, the West, Darfur, and the South, close to South Sudan, the vast majority of the country is incredibly safe. I mean, I've rarely felt safer anywhere than I did in Sudan. And the people were just absolutely brilliantly, wonderfully friendly and calm and gentle and kind. So, I feel very sad about what's happened to Sudan now. I was there in February, and at that point there were protests ramping up to try and get rid of this awful al-Bashir. And I was there towards the end of February. He declared a state of emergency. Not long after I left, he was actually overthrown. And now the military government that overthrew him, which initially had this kind of facade of sort of, democracy and niceness and all, we're going to give people the power that they want, and this is going to be a proper revolution. And now they've made it clear that actually they're exactly the same as he was. I mean, they've killed over 100 people in the city, innocent protesters. It's really awful what's going on there. And having fairly recently cycled through and having friends there, it's definitely hits home exactly what's going on. All these places which, if you haven't been there, they just, you see it on the news, oh, this is happening here, especially in Africa. No one cares about Africa, do they? It's always just, oh, it's Africa, this happens. But these are real places. For me, this is a place I've been recently, and I've met these people, and it's happening, and it's still going on. Certainly one thing about traveling to so many countries is you see bad things happening in these countries, and it makes it a lot more real than if you just, never leave your own country if it's someone else's problem.
Yeah, it's a very sobering things to hear about. What was it like to ride through the Sahara?
The Sahara is just an amazing place. I mean, my favourite time of day was always the nights in the Sahara. Being able to wild camp by myself just in the desert was just incredibly wonderful experience and a real privilege. I mean, I felt completely safe in Sudan. There were some people that expressed worry, but I never felt any danger at all in Sudan. Yeah, just being able to pitch my tent or even just sleep under the stars and just look up at these incredible, spectacular, unpolluted night skies, with sand dunes all around, total silence, feeling like the only person in the world was just unbelievable. I mean, during the day, I had to ride through a few sandstorms. That's not much fun. And it can, of course, it can be boring. You've just got endless sand for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, day after day of pedaling, and it can be dull. But ultimately, I loved it. I mean, cycling through deserts isn't for everyone, certainly, and it's not something I'd want to do all day, every day. But now and then it is really special. I mean, there's a certain magic to it. It gives you a lot of time to think as well. Because you're just, not a lot of steering to be done, not a lot of looking around to be done. So you just kind of head down, you're just thinking your own thoughts, and it's quite meditative cycling through a desert.
So now you are in Tanzania. I'm wondering, did you get a chance to go to Zanzibar?
No, Zanzibar, I was sort of torn. When I was in Nairobi, where I had actually stopped for over a month, taking a proper break there, and I had to decide. I was either going to go west through Uganda and Rwanda and then down into Tanzania, or I was going to go east via Zanzibar. And the charity that I'm riding for, Build Africa, they have several projects in Uganda. So part of what I wanted to do was to actually go out and visit some of the schools that they've worked with, and actually meet some of the staff, meet some of the kids, and then see for myself what's being done. So for that reason, I decided to go to Uganda, go around west, which did unfortunately mean missing Zanzibar. And it's a shame because I've definitely had planned on going, but it's one of them. I'll have to come back for it. There's definitely not enough time to see everywhere in one trip, especially if you're limited to bicycle speed. And I had such an amazing time particularly in Kenya as well. So there's a lot I want to come back to. So I'm sure I'll get around to Zanzibar at some point.
Tristan, tell me a little more about the Build Africa project that you're helping out, and how can people also support that?
Yes, when I set out again from England, I decided that I wanted to ride to fundraise for a charity because, various reasons. For one, I just thought it would be good to make some good come of it. Something like a round-the-world bicycle trip is, in a way, it's very gratuitous. It's very self-indulgent. It's just about yourself and your own adventure. So I wanted to make it about more than that if I could. And I thought that cycling a long way, cycling 100,000 kilometers would be a really good reason for people to support any charity that I had chosen to align myself to. I thought there was a good chance that I could raise some funds for them. And I did a lot of shopping around. There's so many good causes out there, but I wanted one that was going to be UK based. I wanted one that was going to be based in Africa so I could potentially go and visit some projects. And I sort of stumbled across Build Africa and met them, looked at them, talked to them, and I just absolutely loved their kind of outlook, their philosophy. It's a fairly small charity, which I also appreciate. They're mainly focused on children and on education, but they're very much community-centric as well. So I was able to visit a number of their school projects out in Kenya and also recently in Uganda, and it's just been an incredibly humbling experience to see what's actually being done. The staff are just, it's all local people there, and it's just they're so incredibly driven. And these teachers, some of these schools are just so remote. Even getting to these places is an absolute mission. One school, I think they had, even just toilets, as an example. I think there's one school I visited that had 3 squat toilets. Appallingly bad condition. This was a school that hadn't yet been renovated. And 3 squat toilets for nearly 600 people. They have to come out, they get 30 minutes break, and somehow 600 people, including the teachers, have to file into these 3 tiny, disgusting squat toilets. And it's something that we take for granted, just having access to a toilet. But there's so many places in the world where that isn't the case. How do you study in these kind of places? And a big part of why I wanted to help was this idea of privilege. I mean, for me, I've always been very grateful for the fact that if I want to do something, whatever that may be, a career or doing something like this, that my ride, I can do it because I had the education. I know that I can walk into a job almost anywhere, find something. I'm never really in great danger of starving to death. That is an incredible privilege. I mean, it's something we take for granted, but so many parts of the world, they never really get that chance to just do what they want to do, just live a basic life. So I really wanted to try and help if I could. Through Build Africa, I'm really amazed by what they're actually doing out there. I mean, meeting some of these kids that literally go from having no future at all to being able to be whatever they want to be. If they want to be a lawyer, or if they want to be a doctor, if they want to do whatever, they can actually do it if they work hard enough. And it's something that's so simple, but it's something that isn't the case for so many people around the world. So yeah, I'm really, really happy that I am able to raise some money for the charity and actually help in that way. And it definitely gives me a lot of motivation as well. I mean, you asked before what keeps me going, and certainly the charity is a big part of it, knowing that I'm not just riding for myself, but I am actually riding for a greater purpose. So that is also a big help to me.
And if people want to donate, how do they do so?
It's really easy. I have a fundraising page. So that's just it's a Virgin Money Giving fundraising page. You can get to that through my website, just on the charity page there. And you can just donate very easily using any card or PayPal, I think. So it just goes directly through to the charity. All the money goes straight to these projects. You know, it's really amazing how much difference even a small donation actually makes. I mean, even sort of $10, which is the price of a couple of cups of coffee in a lot of the world. I mean, that's the difference between sanitary towels for a girl and having to literally not go to school several days a month just because she can't. It's amazing how little goes so far.
Well, Tristan, what's the biggest takeaway so far in this adventure for you?
Oh, there's been so many. My life is completely and utterly changed compared to how it was when I started. I mean, completely different. I'm a completely different person. I think definitely a much better version of who I was, a few years ago before I started. And I guess part of it is just knowing that, I mean, it sounds a little bit cheesy, but you can do anything you want to do. Anything is possible. And it's easy to say that and just say, oh yeah, anything's possible. We know that. But it's another just to actually believe it and just think, if I want to do something, if I really put my mind to it, I can do that. Just fundamentally believe that. So I guess that's something that has given me a lot more confidence in what I can do. And yeah, I mean, it's just opened my eyes to the potential in the world, I suppose. That's a little bit cheesy, but there you go.
I read some of your blog articles. They're very well written. Do you plan on writing a book?
Yeah, I get asked this one a lot. I mean, I certainly plan on writing a book, but I don't know whether it would be a book about my journey cycling around the world. I mean, I suppose I probably will write it, although there are already so many books about people that are cycling around the world, many of them fantastic. So in a way, the market's a little bit saturated. I don't know if the world needs another book about a bloke cycling around the world. I think there's a good chance I probably will do it eventually, yeah. Certainly, I very much enjoy writing, so I think writing is going to be a part of my future no matter what I end up doing.
Well, what is next for you?
Oh God. Well, I mean, it's so many years still to ride for me that I'm not really thinking much beyond that at this stage. I mean, I'm a few months away from finishing off Africa in Cape Town, and then from there I'm going over to South America to spend a couple of years riding up the Americas. I'll certainly have to stop and work somewhere along the way before Alaska anyway, and then back across to Japan to ride through Asia again, and eventually finish back in England in a few years. But it's so far away still, and so much can happen in that kind of time frame. I mean, I always sort of say a year in cycling around the world time is like 5 years in normal lifetime, because so much happens to you every day. I mean, every day is so different. It's so intensely packed with new experiences. So, I mean, 3 or 4 years more of this, I have no idea who I'll be. I don't know what I want to do. So, I mean, any ideas that I have now are unlikely to survive the gauntlet of another few years on the road. But yeah, I'm just sort of open to whatever comes, I suppose.
I like that phrase, survive the gauntlet.
Yeah, a long way to go.
Tristan, how can people contact you if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm pretty contactable. I have sort of fairly active on social media, so through Instagram or Facebook, I'm on there. My website has a contact email. So yeah, either any of these, I usually have internet internet, unless I'm somewhere very remote, which does happen, but generally I can get back to people within a week. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, then feel free to hit me up.
Tristan Ridley, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with us and your journey so far. And that's Tristan, by the way, TristanRidley at tristanridley.com. And just continued success on your journey and on your fundraising goals.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Nice talking to you.
Thank you for listening. You can find this episode online at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ177. That's TPZ177. Be sure to head over to thepursuitzone.com for the link to subscribe to the show. And like the show on Facebook, follow along on Twitter. The tags are at The Pursuit Zone. If you want to send me some feedback, please do so. My email is paul@thepursuitzone.com, or you can leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. This episode was recorded on June 25th, 2019. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.